What if desperation leads a wealthy mogul to hire a homeless woman as a surrogate? Witness a choice that shatters expectations and brings even a billionaire to his knees. Richard Maxwell was the kind of billionaire others admired from a distance. His name graced glossy business magazines, and his towering offices symbolized triumph in the global real estate market. Yet despite his widespread influence, Richard spent many nights alone, consumed by an empty ache. Beneath his power and wealth lay a deeply rooted longing for family, a scar from losing his parents early and never knowing the warmth of a genuine home. The grand penthouse suite in which he lived was all shimmering surfaces and architectural marvels, but each echoing hallway reminded him there was no heir to inherit his legacy or his cherished memories. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of the city, Nora Atkins huddled under a threadbare coat in a makeshift shelter. Homelessness had crept up on her after she lost her job due to an abrupt company shutdown, and one medical emergency drained what was left of her savings. Determined to survive, she often relied on soup kitchens and minimal day work. The bitterness of being dismissed by society weighed heavily, yet she never lost her empathy. She would share spare change with others even more desperate, holding on to hope that somehow she might find a way out of her nightmare. A twist of fate steered these two souls onto a collision course. Richard, consumed by the absence of a family and weary from countless lonely evenings, sought unconventional means to fulfill his dream of fatherhood. He convinced himself that a business-like agreement might spare him from emotional entanglements, an ironic notion for a man whose life revolved around contracts and negotiations. After exhausting various routes, he confided in a discreet legal consultant who suggested a private arrangement, hiring a surrogate, preferably someone desperate enough to agree quickly and keep their distance afterward. At the same time, Nora found herself cornered by circumstances more dire than ever. A series of thefts in her transient shelter left her with almost nothing. Each day felt like a race to keep her stomach from twisting in hunger. As if guided by an invisible hand, she stumbled upon an obscure advertisement promising a sizable sum to a woman willing to bear a child for an extremely private client. In the swirling chaos of her life, no address, no reliable source of income, and no visible path forward, this singular opportunity felt like a lifeline. With trembling resolve, she dialed the number listed, unaware of just how deeply it would alter her existence. When Nora arrived for the first meeting, she was overwhelmed by the gleaming glass walls, hushed halls, and the understated luxury of Richard's private office suite. Everything about her felt out of place. Her worn shoes, her thrift store blouse, her trembling hands that clutched a small bag containing every possession she had left. Richard, accustomed to negotiations worth millions, noticed the faint tremor in her voice as she introduced herself. Observing her hollow cheeks and cautious eyes, he realized that this was no ordinary business transaction. Someone's very survival was at stake. Though Richard prided himself on rational decision-making, a surge of guilt rippled through him. Hiring a homeless woman to bear his child felt morally complicated, but he soothed his conscience by promising that he would treat her fairly, providing both financial and medical support. They signed a confidentiality agreement, carefully crafted to protect Richard's identity. Nora struggled to steady her signature on the dotted line, aware that she was exchanging her body's most intimate labor for a chance to escape destitution. Despite the moral dilemmas that gnawed at them both, the deal was sealed. For Nora, it was a bridge between despair and the faint promise of hope. For Richard, it was an opportunity to finally become a father. Shortly thereafter, Nora was whisked into a structured routine designed to ensure her health and the health of the unborn child. She moved into a modest apartment funded by Richard, away from the perilous streets that had once been her only refuge. Though the arrangement spared her from constant hunger and harsh weather, she found it impossible to fully relax. Each day began with prenatal care visits and ended with phone calls from Richard's advisor, verifying her well-being and reminding her of the terms of their agreement. Richard, while closely monitoring her progress through updates, maintained his distance, he preferred not to blur the lines of the contract by making their interactions too personal. Instead, he funneled resources into every aspect of her life, convinced that meticulous planning could prevent emotional chaos. Yet his own nights remained sleepless, haunted by a vague sense of unease that money alone couldn't quiet. He told himself this was the cleanest way to realize his paternal aspirations without risking heartbreak or dependency. Meanwhile, Nora wrestled with apprehension, wondering if her body and her spirit would withstand 9 months of carrying a billionaire's heir under such a cold, clinical arrangement. Nora Atkins settled into the small apartment Richard Maxwell had arranged, finding each day to be a peculiar mix of relief and unease. On one hand, she finally had a roof over her head and the promise of prenatal care, a stark contrast to the bleakness of the streets she once called home. On the other hand, the terms of their agreement remained rigid. She spoke to Richard's personal assistant, Ms. Chambers, more often than to Richard himself. Ms. Chambers managed everything from scheduling doctor's appointments to ensuring Nora followed her strict nutritional plan. Every interaction seemed clinical, reminding Nora that this was not a relationship built on compassion or friendship, but rather a contractual obligation. Occasionally, Nora reflected on her old life, particularly late at night when she found it difficult to sleep. In her mind's eye, she revisited the homeless shelter where she once scrounged for anything remotely edible. She remembered the worn faces of others who hid their suffering behind forced smiles, people who reassured one another that tomorrow might bring a miracle. Part of her felt guilty for escaping that world while so many remained behind. Still, she clung to the understanding that carrying Richard's child could change everything for her. It might open doors to a life she never thought she could attain. At the same time, Richard immersed himself in a different kind of solitude. During his office hours, he surrounded himself with staff, investors, and clients, maintaining a polished facade of confidence and control. Yet once the last executive handshake ended, he often found himself in his private study, scrolling through reports on Nora's health and well-being. The swirl of business achievements no longer held the same allure they once did. He realized that amidst skyscraper deals and stock market triumphs, he was tethered to a fragile, unborn connection that felt far more consequential than any bottom line. Late one evening, Richard experienced a flashback to his own childhood. Growing up in foster care after an accident claimed his parents, he learned early on that the world could be harsh and unforgiving. He carried with him memories of cramped dormitory rooms, of longing to be chosen by a family that never arrived. Over time, he channeled that abandonment into ambition. He vowed never again to be powerless, amassing wealth and status as armor against the vulnerability he once knew. Now, with Nora carrying his child, he found himself up against a whole new kind of vulnerability, this time bound by his own choice rather than cruel fate. To manage the emotional complexity, Richard compartmentalized everything. He refused to meet Nora in person unless absolutely necessary, preferring to receive updates through Ms. Chambers and Dr. Elaine Connor, the obstetrician he had hired to oversee the pregnancy. Dr. Connor's reports were thorough, detailing Nora's progress in precise medical language. Each week, Richard read the notes with a mixture of relief and trepidation. The child was growing well, but Richard often wrestled with an unsettling question. Could he truly handle the emotional weight of fatherhood, given the transactional way he had orchestrated it? Nora, for her part, occasionally felt pangs of loneliness. Even though she was no longer out on the streets, she was isolated by the very nature of the arrangement. She had no family to share the journey with, and her calls to old acquaintances often went unanswered, as many had scattered or drifted away. Yet she pushed on, reminding herself that the daily monotony, pregnancy supplements, checkups, bed rest, was a small price to pay for a chance to build a more stable life once the contract ended. Through it all, she nurtured a growing sense that this child deserved more than a mere transaction. Regardless of Richard's distance, she found herself quietly singing lullabies at night, imagining a future where her baby might know love beyond contracts and clauses. As the pregnancy progressed, Nora's routine became increasingly regimented. Early in the morning, Ms. Chambers would arrive with a folder listing daily tasks, light exercises recommended by the doctor, specific meal plans, and scheduled time for fresh air in the building's courtyard. Nora found these routines comforting in some ways, yet confining in others. She felt like a caretaker in her own right, charged with protecting the life growing inside her. But each doctor's visit reminded her of the business-like nature of the arrangement. The private clinic's staff treated her kindly, yet Nora suspected they all knew precisely why she was there, a case funded by an incredibly wealthy patron who remained conspicuously absent. Sometimes, in the waiting room, Nora would quietly observe the other expectant mothers who arrived with partners or relatives. She listened to their excitement over baby names, nursery colors, and future hopes. In those moments, she fought an acute sense of isolation. Despite having the financial backing to ensure her physical comfort, she lacked the emotional net that usually accompanies bringing a new life into the world. Driven by an odd mixture of gratitude and resentment, she reminded herself that she was forging a different path, a path that might deliver financial security, even if it lacked warmth. On the opposite side of town, Richard's personal life grew more compartmentalized. He continued to host lavish business dinners in his penthouse, impressing foreign investors and corporate allies. Behind the scenes, though, he found himself increasingly restless. During these gatherings, he would sometimes drift into reveries, imagining a baby's cry echoing through the stark corridors of his home. On a few occasions, he caught himself wondering if he should transform one of the unused rooms into a nursery, but each time such thoughts emerged, he shoved them aside, unwilling to invest emotionally in a child he had not yet met, and whose mother he viewed primarily as a surrogate provider. As a distraction, Richard plunged deeper into philanthropic endeavors, funding arts programs and educational scholarships. The media lauded him as a generous titan of industry, but he knew deep down that his efforts to help the world stemmed partly from personal guilt. At high society galas, he received praise from acquaintances who had no idea about the arrangement with Nora. He accepted their compliments with a stiff smile, aware that his greatest secret, the impending fatherhood he had engineered, was not something he could proudly announce in a public speech. Meanwhile, Nora's health began to fluctuate as she entered the second trimester. The stress of her past life, combined with the inevitable strains of pregnancy, started to weigh on her. Dr. Connor advised more consistent rest and stress reduction, worried that Nora's anxiety could affect the baby. The suggestion triggered a wave of internal questions. Could this arrangement truly be emotionally harmless? Was she risking her mental stability for a financial payout? Nora found a fleeting sense of solace in small acts of self-care, from reading borrowed library books to decorating her tiny space with hand-drawn sketches of landscapes she remembered from better days. Amid these changes, Dr. Connor sensed that the emotional distance between Richard and Nora posed a risk to Nora's well-being. Though no direct confrontation happened, the doctor gently hinted to Ms. Chambers that genuine human contact might actually help Nora handle the growing pressure. But Ms. Chambers, ever the diligent assistant, was hesitant to breach her employer's boundaries. She worried that involving Richard more personally might complicate matters, especially given his propensity to keep personal relationships at arm's length. In the end, she merely noted the doctor's concerns, promising to pass along the recommendation. Nora, however, remained largely unaware that anyone was advocating for her, and Richard, safely insulated by layers of intermediaries, continued to watch from a measured distance. When Nora reached the midpoint of her pregnancy, an unexpected event rattled her carefully managed existence. One late afternoon, she fainted while strolling through the courtyard. A security guard found her slumped against a bench, pale and trembling. Alarmed staff rushed her to the clinic where Dr. Connor conducted a thorough examination. The results revealed severe exhaustion and signs of malnutrition despite the structured meal plans. The incident underscored how fragile Nora's condition truly was. Although Ms. Chambers reported the situation to Richard immediately, his reaction surprised everyone. He demanded daily updates on Nora's status, repeatedly asking why her medical regimen had failed to prevent this crisis. In a rare move, he requested a private consultation with Dr. Connor, who explained that no prenatal plan, however meticulously designed, could replace genuine human support. The doctor emphasized that carrying a child is both a physical and emotional journey, and if Nora felt isolated or overwhelmed, her body could bear the brunt of that stress. Faced with this reality, Richard confronted a surge of guilt. He had believed that providing funds and top-tier health care would be enough, yet seeing that plan falter forced him to reconsider his strategy. On impulse, he decided to visit Nora in person at the clinic, the first time he would do so since their initial meeting. He walked the sterile white corridors, feeling the tension in his shoulders rise with each step. Nurses glanced his way, likely recognizing him from newspaper features lauding his business prowess, but said nothing as he made his way to Nora's hospital room. Inside, he found her propped up on pillows, looking weary but relieved that someone had come. She kept her gaze lowered, unsure of how to behave around the man whose child she carried. Richard, similarly uncertain, stood near the foot of the bed. The silence between them felt palpable, laden with unasked questions about their unusual bond. Though no words were exchanged, each could sense the other's vulnerability. In that moment, Richard realized that for all his wealth, he lacked the emotional language to comfort a woman who was risking her life for his dream of fatherhood. Over the following week, Nora's condition improved, largely thanks to added rest and adjusted medication. Ms. Chambers arranged for a live-in caretaker, an older woman named Sarah Lindholm, who exuded a grandmotherly warmth. Sarah's presence brought a semblance of normalcy to Nora's world. The caretaker would fix simple meals, hum lullabies, and occasionally share anecdotes from her own life. Though the arrangement was still funded and orchestrated by Richard's team, Nora felt less alone for the first time in months. Sarah represented a human connection in an otherwise impersonal journey. Meanwhile, Richard grappled with newfound doubts about his own capacity for compassion. He recalled how, in his younger years, he had yearned for a caring family. Now, ironically, he was on the verge of creating a family through a contract, yet he seemed poised to perpetuate the same emotional chasm he once despised. This internal conflict crystallized one evening as he paced his penthouse, gazing out over the sparkling city lights. He questioned whether he could truly embrace fatherhood if he remained guarded behind business protocols and signed agreements. Nevertheless, he was not ready to dismantle the barriers he had built. He instructed his staff to bolster every aspect of Nora's care: better nutrition, private exercise sessions, frequent home visits from Dr. Connor. But he still maintained a personal distance, fearful of the emotional complexity that might surge if he allowed himself to view Nora as more than a conduit for his child. In the hush of his penthouse, he reminded himself that the arrangement was still best handled through professional means. Yet beneath that rational facade, a tremor of uncertainty hinted that he was already losing control of the narrative he had so meticulously planned. As Nora entered her third trimester, tension crept into every corner of the arrangement. The baby's movements became stronger, and with each kick, Nora felt an odd mixture of hope and dread. She knew that once the child was born, her role in Richard's life would fundamentally change. According to their contract, she would be well compensated and guided toward a stable future, but it remained unclear what sort of emotional involvement she might have with her own child. She wrestled with conflicting desires: the promise of a new life free from homelessness, yet the growing maternal bond that urged her to think beyond mere financial transactions. In the midst of these swirling emotions, Sarah Lindholm's gentle presence continued to be a welcome balm. Occasionally, the caretaker would recount her own experience of raising 2 children. Even without direct admonitions, it became clear to Nora that no mother could truly sever emotional ties with her offspring, no matter the terms of any agreement. She began to wonder if she could simply walk away once the baby arrived. Thoughts of holding her child for the first time lit a small flame of longing in her chest, one that refused to be doused by legal stipulations. Simultaneously, Richard found himself pulled in conflicting directions. In a rare shift, he had begun visiting the apartment once every few weeks, sometimes bringing small gifts, a specialized pregnancy pillow, or a selection of prenatal vitamins. While these gestures hinted at a desire to connect, they were overshadowed by his reserved demeanor. He carefully avoided discussing the future beyond curt reassurances that Nora would be well taken care of. More than once, he caught himself staring at Nora's growing belly, feeling a tremor of awe at the life forming within. Yet each time that feeling stirred, he would quickly exit, citing urgent business matters to attend to. The friction between them became more apparent one afternoon when Dr. Connor arrived for a routine checkup. In the midst of a quiet apartment, the doctor delicately touched upon the need for both parents to prepare emotionally for the child's arrival. Richard listened without comment, his expression carefully neutral. Nora, reclined on the couch, listened as well, but found her heart racing. She sensed that the time for vague assumptions was running out. Soon there would be a real, living baby needing love, care, and belonging. Was she truly ready to surrender that precious life, despite all her maternal instincts? Meanwhile, Ms. Chambers confided privately to Dr. Connor that Richard was losing his composure behind closed doors. The assistant revealed that he spent late nights pacing, scanning every new medical report for the slightest anomaly. He appeared troubled by nightmares, often calling staff after midnight to review contingency plans for any obstetric emergency. While Ms. Chambers carried out her duties with unflagging professionalism, she couldn't help but notice that Richard seemed frightened, less of the child itself, and more of the uncharted emotional territory that fatherhood would inevitably demand. The strain reached a breaking point when Nora experienced an episode of Braxton Hicks contractions late one evening. Panicked, Sarah phoned Dr. Connor, who rushed to the apartment to perform an examination. Though the contractions were false alarms, the scare jolted everyone's nerves. In the aftermath, Richard arrived breathless and visibly shaken. He stayed for several hours, pacing the living room and glancing anxiously at Nora, who lay in bed, exhausted from the ordeal. The entire scene crystallized the reality that all of them, Nora, Richard, and even the staff, were bound by a situation far more profound than any contract could capture. By the time Nora's contractions subsided, the emotional distance that once seemed so easy to maintain started to collapse under the weight of genuine concern. Though Richard departed in his usual abrupt manner, he left behind an unmistakable tension in the apartment, a sense that something larger than any of them had planned was now unfolding. With the baby's due date rapidly approaching, every participant in this fragile arrangement stood on the brink of revelations that would challenge their carefully held assumptions about family, love, and responsibility. Nora woke one morning to a sudden sharp jolt of discomfort in her abdomen. Nearly 8 months pregnant, she had grown accustomed to the twinges and aches of a rapidly shifting body. But this felt different, more urgent, more commanding. She steadied herself against the wall, her breath catching as another wave coursed through her. It subsided swiftly, leaving her with a thudding heartbeat and a potent sense of foreboding. Though it was still early for labor, fear prickled through her, worrying that her child might arrive prematurely. Her caretaker, Sarah Lindholm, noticed Nora's pale complexion and immediately called Dr. Elaine Connor. Within the hour, the doctor arrived, carrying a portable medical kit and wearing the calm but focused expression of someone used to high-stakes scenarios. After a quick examination, Dr. Connor concluded that Nora might be experiencing preterm contractions, possibly triggered by stress. The doctor recommended complete bed rest and minimal exertion, warning that the next few weeks were crucial. If the baby came too soon, complications could arise. Nora felt a wave of guilt, suspecting that her fluctuating emotions and persistent worry might be affecting the child in ways she couldn't control. While this crisis unfolded, Richard Maxwell was in the final stages of negotiating a massive international deal. On any other day, He would have been enthralled by spreadsheets and phone calls with overseas partners. However, Ms. Chambers' phone call disrupted his focus. She reported Nora's condition in careful detail, urging him to reconsider the emotional toll his aloofness might be taking on both mother and unborn baby. Richard hesitated, caught between the demands of his empire and the fragile life that depended on him. Though he prided himself on composure, he felt a tremor of genuine panic. After ending the call, he stared out the polished window of his executive office, the cityscape suddenly looking distant and inconsequential compared to the new reality swirling around Nora. By late afternoon, Richard arrived unannounced at Nora's apartment, instructing his driver to wait outside. Sarah greeted him, quietly explaining that Nora was resting, but still enduring intermittent contractions. Entering Nora's room, Richard found her propped up against a cushion, eyes half-lidded from a recent dose of medication. The tension between them was palpable. He stood at the threshold, uncertain whether to approach her bedside or maintain a formal distance. Nora, too exhausted to mask her feelings, simply gazed at him with a flicker of gratitude. Despite everything, she was relieved that he had come in person. For the first time, Richard stayed longer than just an hour. He paced the small living area, conferring with Dr. Connor and Ms. Chambers about medical strategies while Sarah prepared extra bedding and nourishment for Nora. He reviewed the proposed birth plan, learning about potential complications if the baby did not remain in utero for at least a few more weeks. Although he insisted on top-of-the-line care, he couldn't silence the gnawing sense that he might have contributed to this precarious situation by keeping himself too remote, too mechanical. That evening, the contractions receded somewhat, and Nora managed a few hours of uneasy sleep. Before leaving, Richard lingered by the apartment door. He cast a final glance toward Nora's room, mind churning with guilt and anticipation. The child was not yet born, but it was already dominating his thoughts, challenging every assumption he had about control and responsibility. Stepping into the quiet hallway, he realized that the barrier he had erected, meant to guard him from emotional risk, was now threatening something infinitely precious. Somewhere within, he began to recognize that this was not merely about fulfilling his dream of an heir. It was also about confronting his own capacity to care, or to fail utterly at it. The following 2 weeks turned into a trial of endurance for everyone involved. Nora's condition stabilized enough for her to avoid premature labor, but she remained on strict bed rest. Sarah Lindholm maintained a watchful presence, helping Nora with everything from meals to gentle stretching exercises meant to alleviate the discomfort of constant reclining. Dr. Connor visited more frequently than ever, employing a blend of medical expertise and empathetic reassurance. Yet, the doctor could not entirely quell the undercurrent of tension that snaked through the apartment. For Nora, these days felt both excruciatingly slow and terrifyingly swift. She spent long hours staring at the ceiling or rubbing her abdomen, silently imploring the baby to stay safe. At night, her mind drifted to earlier times, her teenage years spent in foster homes, the short-lived waitressing job that gave her hope of stability, and the devastating sequence of events that led to sleeping on the streets. Those memories clung to her, highlighting how drastically life had changed since agreeing to Richard's contract. In an odd sense, she felt in limbo, no longer the impoverished wanderer, not yet the free mother she imagined she could become once her role was done. Meanwhile, Richard oscillated between boardrooms and hospital consultations. He continued to run his sprawling corporation, but the gravity of Nora's circumstances weighed on him. He would appear at the apartment with fresh flowers, healthy snacks recommended by Dr. Connor, or the occasional personal keepsake. Despite these gestures, he remained guarded, unsure of how to express genuine care without relinquishing the emotional distance he'd so carefully protected. Each time he visited, he noticed Nora growing a little weaker, a little more anxious, and he found himself increasingly disturbed by the knowledge that he had orchestrated this precarious situation. At one point, Richard confided in Ms. Chambers late in the evening, a rare display of vulnerability. He explained that he feared not only the physical risks to Nora and the baby, but also the possibility that he wasn't prepared to be a father. Ms. Chambers, ever tactful, encouraged him to consider that real parenthood demands more than financial resources. It requires a willingness to be present, open, and vulnerable. Though her words were measured, they cut through Richard's usual defenses. He spent that night in restless contemplation, replaying the cautious warnings Dr. Connor had shared about Nora's emotional state, and how crucial it was for both parents to provide a nurturing environment. Then, one brisk morning, the baby decided to announce its readiness to enter the world. Nora woke from a light doze, gasping in pain. This time, the contractions felt sharper, more rhythmic, and unmistakably the real thing. Sarah tried to keep Nora calm while Ms. Chambers called for an ambulance to transfer her to the private maternity ward Richard had arranged. Within minutes, a medical team whisked Nora into a waiting vehicle, hooking her up to monitors and IV drips. Anxiety radiated through the group. Even seasoned healthcare professionals sensed that this was no ordinary case. Richard raced to the hospital, his heart pounding as he navigated the maze of white corridors. Spotting Dr. Connor, he demanded to know Nora's condition. The doctor's expression was carefully poised, explaining that labor had begun in earnest, but there could be complications. Lowering her voice, Dr. Connor confided that the baby might face respiratory challenges if born earlier than expected. Richard felt an icy dread coil in his gut, the first tangible sense that his plan could end in tragedy. At that moment, business deals, corporate alliances, and all his success seemed to dissolve into insignificance. All he could think about was the life inside that delivery room and the woman who had risked everything to make it possible. Nora's labor extended through the rest of the day, punctuated by waves of searing pain and exhaustion. The medical staff bustled around her with urgent efficiency, adjusting monitors and offering words of encouragement. She clung to fleeting moments of clarity between contractions, silently wondering if the child she was about to bring into the world would have a future shaped by warmth or emotional distance. Yet, despite her doubts, she fought with every ounce of will she had left, determined to protect the fragile life she carried. In the hospital corridor, Richard stood by a large window, listening to the faint echoes of beeping machines and muffled voices. Periodically, Ms. Chambers or Sarah Lindholm emerged to update him on Nora's progress. He responded with terse nods, too overwhelmed to articulate much else. With each new detail, the tension in his chest tightened. He had spent his life believing that meticulous planning and ample finances could solve any problem. But at that moment, he recognized that no strategy could guarantee the outcome he desperately craved. An infant's safe arrival was not a commodity to be bought. It was a miracle that defied transactional logic. After several hours, Dr. Connor finally beckoned Richard into a small waiting area just outside the delivery suite. The doctor's face held both concern and compassion. Nora's body was under tremendous stress, and the baby's heartbeat had shown fluctuations that hinted at distress. Richard felt his pulse spike at the mere mention of potential complications. He wanted to demand that the best specialists in the world be summoned, that every resource be leveraged. Yet for the first time, he sensed that money might not be enough to shield him from life's merciless unpredictability. When Dr. Connor returned to the delivery room, Richard found himself pacing alone in the hallway, battling a wave of helplessness. Sarah quietly approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. She had come to see him not just as a billionaire employer, but as a man teetering on the edge of an emotional precipice. Though her role was caregiver to Nora, she understood that Richard, too, needed a measure of reassurance. She gently reminded him that, regardless of how this had all started, the baby was a child, not an asset. If he wanted to be a father, he had to be ready for heartbreak, joy, and everything in between. Moments later, the doors burst open and a medical assistant summoned Richard inside. Nora was in the final stage of labor, her face contorted with pain and resolve. Machines beeped in frantic rhythms, tracking both mother and baby. The fluorescent lights glared, illuminating the stark reality of birth's raw intensity. Richard hovered by the edge of the room, heart pounding, unsure if he even had the right to hold Nora's hand. Yet as he watched her struggle, his protective instincts flared. He moved closer, wanting to lend whatever strength he could, though he had no idea how to do so in that moment. Dr. Connor commanded the room, issuing instructions to nurses while Nora pushed with gritted determination. Sweat drenched her brow, and her eyes glistened with tears of pain and fear. The next few minutes played out in a blur. A frantic flurry of activity, a series of sharp cries, and finally a piercing wail that echoed through the sterile space. The baby had arrived. But Nora's relief lasted only seconds. A hush fell over the medical team, followed by hushed murmurs that something wasn't right. The newborn's color appeared off, and its cries were weak, as if lacking the vitality one would expect from a healthy infant. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He watched in terror as the child was whisked away to a nearby station, where additional nurses and a neonatal specialist surrounded the tiny, fragile form. Nora, too fatigued to even raise her head, tried to crane her neck, but Dr. Connor softly urged her to lie still. Within the swirl of tension, Richard felt the final shards of his protective facade shatter. Here, before his eyes, lay the life he had meticulously planned to bring into existence. Yet now it seemed heartbreakingly vulnerable, a living testament to the limits of his control. In that searing moment, the question of whether he could truly be a father was dwarfed by a far more urgent question. Would he even get the chance? The medical team worked rapidly, applying suction, administering oxygen, and monitoring the baby's vital signs. Across the room, Nora's eyes fluttered open and shut, her body drained from hours of labor. Despite her exhaustion, she caught glimpses of the frantic activity and felt an overwhelming terror swell in her chest. In a panic, she silently pleaded for the child to breathe, to cry out with the strength that signified life. She knew she had no power left to intervene, and that powerlessness felt worse than any physical pain she had endured. Richard, seeing the neonatologist's grim expression, found himself drawn to the small table where they were working on his newborn. Nurses stepped aside to make room for him, and for a moment he locked eyes on his child's chest, noticing faint but labored movements. All at once, the air seemed to leave Richard's lungs. He reached out with trembling fingers, hoping, in some unconscious way, that his presence could convey the will to survive. Memories of his own neglected childhood flooded his mind. Moments of isolation in the foster system, nights spent longing for a parent's reassuring touch. Tears blurred his vision as he realized he was inches away from making or breaking the cycle of loneliness that had defined him. Then, in a sudden flash of movement, the baby's breathing strengthened. A fragile cry escaped those tiny lungs, not robust yet, but enough to signal a glimmer of hope. The neonatologist nodded for a nurse to hand the baby to Richard, who instinctively knelt beside the station, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was holding. The abruptness of it all, kneeling on a hospital floor, arms cradling his own child, dissolved any lingering reservations he had about fatherhood. The tears that coursed down his face were unlike anything he had ever felt before. Raw, unfiltered gratitude mixed with a profound sense of responsibility. Nora, fighting through her own fatigue, recognized that faint cry as the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She managed to lift her head slightly, just in time to see Richard kneeling with the baby. Although their paths had converged through a cold, impersonal contract, that scene resonated with a depth of emotion that no legal document could encompass. In that moment, she understood that her body had carried not just an heir for a billionaire, but a vulnerable life brimming with its own promise and challenges. Richard remained on his knees, tears unabashedly flowing as the baby let out another muffled whimper. Nurses hovered nearby, ready to intervene if necessary, but the immediate crisis seemed to be easing. The child's color slowly improved and a monitor beeped more reassuringly. Looking at the infant's delicate features, a tiny nose, Closed eyes fluttering with new awareness, Richard felt as though every ambition and achievement in his past paled in comparison to this small, shuddering being. He whispered silent apologies in his heart, for treating the pregnancy as a mere transaction, for allowing fear to overshadow compassion. Moments later, Dr. Connor announced that the baby was stable enough for further observation in the neonatal unit. As the staff gently coaxed the newborn from Richard's arms, he rose on unsteady legs and turned toward Nora. Her eyes fluttered with exhaustion, tears coursing down her cheeks. But she mustered a faint nod that conveyed both relief and a sense of shared accomplishment. In those fleeting seconds, they both glimpsed a truth that overshadowed every contract clause, every plan for post-birth arrangements. They had created a life that demanded courage and unconditional love. Outside the delivery room, Ms. Chambers, Sarah Lindholm, and a few staff members waited anxiously for news. When a nurse appeared, sharing that the baby was alive, though under careful watch, quiet applause and choked sobs rippled through the group. No one seemed to care about hierarchical roles or official job titles. Instead, they stood united by the raw joy and collective relief that a child had been given a chance to take its first steps into the world. For Richard, the moment of kneeling on the hospital floor, tears streaming down his face as he held his newborn, shattered any illusion that fatherhood could remain a purely business arrangement. Whether he had intended to or not, he had pledged himself to this infant's well-being. And for Nora, the line between surrogate mother and parental bond blurred irreversibly. In the hours that followed, the medical staff guided them both through the next steps, but the emotional landscape was irreversibly changed. A baby's cry had cut through every layer of pretense, forging connections too profound to be dismissed by contract terms alone. In the days following the baby's birth, an unspoken truce formed between Nora and Richard. Though neither had expected to navigate these emotional waters together, the experience in the delivery room seemed to melt the barriers that once kept them apart. The newborn remained under close watch in the neonatal ward, his tiny form connected to monitors that tracked every breath and heartbeat. Even in this sterile, high-tech environment, Richard found himself silently captivated by the child's fragility, standing at the edge of the incubator with a protective hand resting on the glass. Nora was given a private room to recover, her body still aching from the intense labor and the weeks of uncertainty preceding it. Frequent visits from Sarah Lindholm and Dr. Connor helped her cope with the physical and emotional aftermath. She would catch glimpses of Richard in the corridor, his forehead creased with a mix of relief and worry. Occasionally he approached her door, offering a brief nod or a subdued greeting. With each passing day, words felt less necessary. Their mutual concern for the baby overshadowed the contractual nature of their relationship, forging a bond that neither had anticipated but both cautiously embraced in their own ways. As the baby's condition stabilized, the medical team began to lower the machine's settings, allowing the child to breathe more independently. This gradual progress felt like a series of small miracles to everyone involved. Nora, in a hospital gown and slippers, shuffled into the neonatal unit whenever she was strong enough, gazing at the tiny face that seemed at once so familiar and so new. At times, she pressed her hand gently against the incubator, marveling at the delicate life she had carried for months. Richard also found himself drawn to the neonatal ward with increasing frequency. Initially, he kept a respectful distance, unsure if Nora would welcome his presence after the emotionally fraught journey they'd shared. But as the baby's health improved, the nurses encouraged both mother and father to participate in basic caregiving tasks, such as changing diapers and carefully holding the newborn against their skin for short intervals. These moments, though brief, proved transformative. Holding the baby's warm, tiny body against his chest, Richard realized he was no longer merely fulfilling a contract. He was stepping into the daunting realm of fatherhood. The child's soft whimpers seemed to echo in his mind long after he returned to his silent penthouse. News of the birth filtered through Richard's personal and professional spheres, though discreetly. Ms. Chambers fielded curious inquiries from close colleagues and sympathetic well-wishers, providing measured updates without revealing the more intimate details of how Nora came to bear Richard's child. Over late-night conversations, she confided in Sarah Lindholm that Richard's once impenetrable demeanor was showing cracks. He seemed prone to bouts of uncharacteristic silence, and his eyes carried a gentler expression whenever the baby was mentioned. Corporate negotiations still marched forward, but in private, Richard seemed far more invested in a new venture, learning how to be emotionally present in his infant son's life. Meanwhile, Nora began contemplating her future with a mixture of trepidation and hope. The original agreement had been clear. After delivering the child, she would receive a substantial settlement and the promise of a stable residence. Yet her heart clenched at the thought of walking away. Each time she visited the neonatal ward, the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around hers, giving her a rush of maternal warmth. She whispered lullabies during those visits, recalling how she once sang to him in the darkness of her old apartment. The realization that she had forged an unbreakable bond with this little soul weighed heavily on her conscience. By the end of the second week, doctors deemed the baby strong enough to move into a regular infant nursery. As the tubing and monitors were gradually removed, Nora and Richard were encouraged to care for him more directly, bottle feeding, swaddling, and learning to soothe his cries. In a quiet hospital hallway, they tentatively discussed names, each offering suggestions with hesitant smiles. Though their conversations were still marked by caution, the shared focus on the child allowed a fragile closeness to surface. Returning to Nora's hospital room one afternoon, Richard found her holding the baby, softly humming a tune that drifted through the sterile air like a gentle balm. Without waiting for an invitation, he sat beside her, their arms nearly touching. Nora glanced at him with an unreadable expression, searching his face for signs of the aloof billionaire she once knew. Instead, she saw a man whose guarded exterior had been altered by genuine worry, and, more importantly, genuine love for the life they had brought into being. As the baby dozed, Richard quietly reached out, resting a hand on Nora's shoulder. In that unspoken moment, each realized that the falling action of their story was already steering them toward transformations no contract could have ever guaranteed. A week after the baby left the hospital, Richard Maxwell arranged for Nora Atkins and their newborn son to stay in a comfortable suite within his penthouse, an unconventional decision, given his history of guarding his personal space. Though the original agreement stipulated that Nora would move on once the child was born, the experience in the hospital had changed everything. The quiet hush of the penthouse corridors contrasted sharply with the beeping monitors and hushed urgency of the neonatal unit. Here, sunlight streamed through expansive windows, illuminating a freshly decorated nursery that reflected a soft, nurturing palette. Nora marveled at how drastically her life had transformed. She was no longer sleeping on the streets or clinging to meager resources. Yet an undercurrent of uncertainty lingered. Would this new arrangement last, or would she be expected to leave once the baby was healthy enough? Each time she cradled the infant, calming his cries or whispering lullabies, she sensed the irreversibility of her maternal bond. She had grown attached to a life she had initially carried for someone else. Despite the penthouse's luxuries and Richard's growing kindness, Nora worried about when and how she might be asked to relinquish her place in this newly formed family. Meanwhile, Richard wrestled with the implications of Nora and the baby's presence in his home. A man once defined by precise boundaries, he now found his daily routines peppered with tender, chaotic moments. Late-night feedings, the soft cry of an infant waking at dawn, and spontaneous visits to the nursery just to see his son breathing peacefully. Corporate obligations pulled at him from all sides, but his priorities were shifting in ways he never anticipated. The empire he had built began to feel less like a life's mission and more like a means to secure a future for his child. During long conversations with Miss Chambers, Richard admitted he was unsure how to navigate this new stage. He spoke about wanting to be present for milestones like a first smile or a first step, fearing he would repeat the abandonment he felt in foster care. Ms. Chambers, who had witnessed his transformation over the past months, encouraged him to be honest with Nora about his evolving intentions. Though he had the financial means to offer her a stable life elsewhere, what if what both mother and child truly needed was a sense of belonging, within the very walls he had once guarded so fiercely? As days turned into weeks, Nora and Richard fell into a tentative rhythm. They shared brief but genuine exchanges in the penthouse's sleek kitchen, Nora handing the baby to Richard so she could warm a bottle, Richard nodding in gratitude as he awkwardly learned to hold his son's head for proper support. Occasionally, he would catch her eye during these moments, searching for any sign that she might be uncomfortable or uncertain. But Nora, still processing her own tumult of emotions, wore an expression that mixed hope with the lingering fear that this arrangement might be temporary. Outside the penthouse, the rest of the world continued spinning. High-profile deals and elaborate charity events demanded Richard's attendance, while Nora discreetly consulted with Sarah Lindholm about the possibility of re-entering the workforce, something she had not even imagined months ago. Each day the baby grew stronger, beginning to coo and reach for the bright mobiles hanging above his crib. His budding life was a silent testament to the resilience of human bonds. Watching his son thrive, Richard questioned whether a mere contract could ever fully capture the depth of responsibility and love he now felt. In a moment that felt both sudden and inevitable, Richard finally gathered the courage to sit down with Nora and discuss the future of their child, and hers as well. They spoke in the nursery, bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight, while the baby dozed in a cradle that once stood empty in Richard's endless corridors. His voice trembled with uncharacteristic vulnerability as he confessed the guilt he felt about initiating their relationship through a financial agreement, as well as his growing respect for her maternal devotion. Nora, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, acknowledged her own gratitude for the opportunity to escape homelessness and provide a real chance for her son's future. Both understood that no piece of paper could dictate the complexities of parenthood. They decided, haltingly but sincerely, to explore co-parenting, allowing Nora to remain close and raise the baby alongside Richard's support. What began as a transaction was transforming into a partnership. While neither could fully predict what obstacles lay ahead, they recognized that the child deserved more than cold legalities. He deserved parents who chose to stay, to nurture, and to love. In that shared resolution, the cycle of loneliness that once defined both Richard and Nora cracked wide open, letting in the fragile but undeniable light of a new family.